My son told me I was too poor to be seen at his high society wedding. After everything I sacrificed to raise him, he and his fiancée decided my presence didn't fit their precious brand, so they uninvited me from my own son's wedding. But they made one tiny, fatal mistake. They had no idea that the exclusive castle they booked for their dream day was owned by the one man from my past who held the key to my perfect revenge. I sat on a sofa that probably cost more than my car in a living room, so white and empty, it felt like I was in a cloud. It was the kind of expensive that has no personality, just a price tag. My son William sat across from me. His smile stretched so tight, I worried it might snap. Beside him, his fiancée, Lexi, radiated a kind of polished coldness, like a marble statue. I clutched my handbag in my lap, feeling like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a sterile laboratory. The air was thick with the kind of forced pleasantries that come before bad news. They started with a gift. Lexi slid a heavy box across the glass coffee table. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a cashmere throw blanket the color of oatmeal. It was absurdly soft, a whisper of luxury against my work-roughened fingers. William explained it was to keep me cozy in my little house. It was a lovely gesture, I suppose, but it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a payment, a severance package, something to keep me warm after they had frozen me out. Then William started his speech. I could tell it was rehearsed. He couldn't look me in the eye, focusing instead on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. He used words I'd never heard him use before, words from his new corporate life. He talked about optics. He said Lexi's family had a certain brand to maintain. He talked about the expectations of their guests, a list of names that apparently meant more than my own. Lexi would chime in, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern that made my teeth ache. She'd say things like, "We're just worried about you, Eleanor. A long day like that with all those people. It would be too much for you." They were painting a picture of me as a frail, confused old woman who would be a social embarrassment. They were dressing up their cruelty in the language of care, and it was the most insulting thing I had ever experienced. They weren't just uninviting me from my only son's wedding. They were trying to convince me it was my idea, that it was for my own good. That I, the woman who raised him on a shoestring budget, who worked until my bones ached to give him every opportunity, was now a liability. The final blow came softly, almost casually. William took a deep breath, finally flicking his eyes to meet mine for a fraction of a second. He told me they had decided it would be for the best if I celebrated with them at a quiet little brunch, maybe the week after the wedding. His words just hung there in that big, empty room. It wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. I had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. In that moment, I wasn't his mother anymore. I was a problem that had been solved. I just nodded. There were no words. What could I say? My voice had been taken from me, right along with my place in my son's life. I don't remember leaving the penthouse. The walk home was a blur. The familiar Newport streets, usually so charming, felt alien. My heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I was numb, hollowed out. To stop myself from completely falling apart right there on the sidewalk, I ducked into a small art gallery I liked. The quiet and the smell of oil paint were a small comfort. I wasn't really looking at the art, just trying to breathe. My eyes fell on a stack of brochures by the door for a new exhibition. I picked one up, my fingers tracing the glossy paper. The title read, "The Gilded Age Restored, the Billionaire Collection." On the cover was a breathtaking photograph of a seaside castle, all turrets and grandeur, perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. And standing in front of it was a man. His hair was silver now, and his face was lined with the wisdom of years, but I knew his eyes. I would have known them anywhere. It was Gabriel Belmer, my Gabriel. The boy I had loved with all the fierce passion of a first love, the one I had to leave behind almost 50 years ago. My breath caught in my throat. I read the text beneath his name, my heart starting to pound against my ribs. Owner and curator of Belmer Castle, it said, this season's most exclusive wedding venue. A shock cold and electric shot through my entire body. A slow, seismic shift was happening deep inside me. The very place my son had chosen to celebrate his ascent into a world where I didn't belong, the symbol of my exclusion, was owned by the one man who had ever truly seen my worth. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I went home that night and didn't sleep. The hurt from William's words was still there, a deep, cold ache in my bones, but now there was something else alongside it. A flicker. A strange, forgotten warmth. Gabriel Belmer. I had spent nearly 50 years carefully packing away the memory of him, storing it in a place where it couldn't hurt me anymore. And now, in one evening, my son had inadvertently handed me the key to that locked room. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The numbness was gone, replaced by a quiet, clear resolve. I wasn't going to call William, and I certainly wasn't going to call Lexi. Their world had no place for me, and I was done begging for scraps at their table. Instead, I went to an old wooden chest at the foot of my bed, the one that held my art school portfolios and dried up tubes of paint. I rummaged underneath a stack of charcoal sketches until my fingers found it, a small, paint-stained postcard of a lighthouse on the coast of Maine. On the back, in faded ink, was a silly poem he'd written me one summer. I turned it over to the clean side. My hand was steady as I picked up a pen. I didn't write about my son or the wedding or the 50 years that had passed between us. I just wrote a simple professional note. I told him I'd seen the brochure for the Belmer collection and that it looked magnificent. I said I had a few questions about the restoration of his Vermeer if he ever had a moment. I knew he had a Vermeer. He'd dreamed of owning one even when he was a boy with holes in his shoes. I signed it, All My Best Eleanor. Then I put it in an envelope and addressed it not to the Grand Castle, but to a private post office box in town. A box number I hadn't thought of in decades, but had never forgotten. It was a message in a bottle, a subtle probe sent out into the vast ocean of time, a message only he would understand. A week went by. A long, quiet week, where the heavy cashmere blanket they'd given me sat folded on a chair, a silent monument to their betrayal. And then, my phone rang. It was William. His voice was different. The smooth, confident tone he used for his business calls was gone. In its place was a tight, high-pitched anxiety that I recognized from his childhood when he'd broken something valuable. He told me they'd just had their final planning call with the venue. The owner, Mr. Belmer, had been on the line. And then he paused, and I could hear him swallow. He told me that Mr. Belmer had mentioned my name. I felt a slow, delicious warmth spread through my chest. William stumbled over his words as he explained. Apparently, Gabriel had seen my last name on the contract and had asked in the most casual tone if William was by any chance related to the brilliant Eleanor Vance, a master restorer he had known years ago, one who specialized in the Dutch masters. My son, caught completely off guard, had mumbled something about me being his mother. Lexi, he said, tried to laugh it off as a charming little coincidence. Their lies must have been paper thin. They were blindsided, and in his voice I heard the unmistakable sound of panic. The world they had so carefully constructed had just developed a crack, and my ghost had just walked right through it. My first ally was secured, and I hadn't even had to speak his name aloud. Gabriel's innocent question had become a bomb dropped into the middle of their perfect, curated wedding plans. The power had shifted, and they knew it. That evening, the proof arrived in my inbox, an email direct from him. The subject line was simply, Eleanor. The message was short, but it undid 50 years of silence in a handful of sentences. He wrote that it had been far too long. He told me to forget the Vermeer. He said he had a portrait of a lady that had vexed his team for a year and that it needed my hands. There was no question, no polite request. He simply said he wanted me to come to the castle the next day and that he would not take no for an answer. It was signed with a single letter G. It was the same confident, charming, and slightly bossy Gabriel I remembered. It was the warmest invitation I had received in a very long time. The next morning, just as I was getting ready to leave, the phone rang again. This time it was Lexi. Her voice was an instrument of false sweetness, every word coated in sugar to hide the poison underneath. She said William had told her about the lovely coincidence with Mr. Billionaire, how wonderful it all was. Then she got to the point. She said they would be so grateful if I would keep my professional relationship with him discreet. She didn't want to impose on his generosity, she said. It was breathtaking, really. The audacity to manage me to try and control my connection to Gabriel after they had thrown me away. But I heard what she wasn't saying. They weren't just asking for discretion. They were terrified. Terrified of the connection. Terrified of the story I might tell. Terrified of the power I now held without even trying. And in their fear, they showed me exactly how much they stood to lose. I told her I would, of course, be the very soul of discretion. Then I hung up, a small, quiet smile playing on my lips for the first time in a week. After Lexi's call, I sat in my quiet living room and felt the last embers of grief for the son I once knew finally turn to ash. In its place was a cold, hard clarity. They weren't just afraid of me, they were amateurs. Their fear was making them clumsy. So I decided to play the part they had written for me. When William called later that day to nervously follow up, I was the very picture of compliance. I told him that Lexi was right, that it was a silly coincidence, and the last thing I wanted to do was cause any trouble. I promised I would just have a brief professional consultation about the painting and then be on my way. I would stay completely out of their hair. I could hear the relief in his voice, the way his shoulders unclenched over the phone. They believed it. They actually believed they had put me back in my box. They saw the same quiet, unassuming mother they had so easily discarded, and in their arrogance, they felt safe again. They had no idea that a quiet mouse can still chew through the ropes of a cage. While I was laying out my old restoration tools preparing for a life I thought I'd lost, I couldn't help but picture the prison my son had built for himself. I could see him so clearly sitting late at night in a high-rise office that wasn't really his, staring at a screen that dictated his entire existence. I'd seen the signs, of course. The frantic energy behind his ambition, the desperation to shed his working-class skin. I could almost see the memory that surely haunted him 6 months ago. His own small architectural firm circling the drain, standing in the lion's den of his future father-in-law's office. I could imagine the rehearsed plea for a bailout, the humiliating sweat on his brow. And I could hear the cold, transactional reply from Lexi's father, a man who doesn't give gifts, only buys assets. He would have agreed, of course, but on his own chilling terms. He would have made it clear that this wasn't a loan, but an acquisition. William was no longer his own man. He was an investment. And Lexi's happiness, he would have said, was now his primary performance metric. Do not embarrass her. Do not embarrass me. My son wasn't just cruel, he was owned. He had sold his soul for a view of the harbor and a lifetime of looking over his shoulder. The next day, I walked through the iron gates of Bellmare Castle, and it felt less like entering a stranger's home and more like stepping into my own past. The air smelled of sea salt and old stone. While my son was trapped in his gilded cage, I was finally rediscovering my freedom. Gabriel was waiting for me in the grand entryway. He wasn't a boy anymore, but the warmth in his eyes was unchanged, and it melted 50 years of distance in a single moment. There were no awkward questions, no talk of the past. He just smiled and said my name, and it felt like coming home. He led me through halls lined with masterpieces, but he didn't stop until we reached the magnificent grand ballroom, its tall windows looking out over the roaring Atlantic. It was the very room my son had booked for his reception. And there, in the center of the gleaming floor, stood an easel. On it was a portrait of a woman, her face obscured by centuries of grime and cracked varnish. Gabriel told me he needed it finished before the first wedding of the season. He wanted me to work right there on site. He told me I would have full access, that I should consider the place my own. He was handing me the keys to the castle, the very symbol of my son's ambition, and inviting me to make it my workshop. A few days later, Lexi, drunk on her perceived victory, made her final, fatal mistake. She was at the castle with her wedding planner, a call William would later tell me about in a frantic, hushed tone. Believing I was safely neutralized, just a brief consultant who had come and gone, she had let her true colors fly. As she pointed around the grand ballroom, finalizing the layout for the tables and the dance floor, she'd waved a dismissive hand toward the corner where my easel had been set up. She had told the planner to please ensure the restoration staff was kept well away from the guests during the reception. She said they couldn't have the help mingling with their important friends. It was, she'd insisted, a matter of optics. Even William in his weakened state had flinched. She still saw me as the help. A faceless, unimportant worker to be managed and kept out of sight, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire carefully crafted future now rested in the palm of my paint-stained hand. The day of the unveiling, as I'd come to think of it, was bright and clear. The sunlight streamed through the tall ballroom windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and making the ocean outside sparkle. I was working on the portrait, carefully lifting away a layer of darkened varnish from the lady's cheek, and Gabriel was beside me, telling me a story about how he'd acquired the painting at a chaotic auction in Paris. There was an ease between us, a comfortable silence that 50 years hadn't managed to erase. In that castle, with a brush in my hand, I felt more myself than I had in a very long time. It was in the middle of this peaceful moment that I heard them arrive. The sound of Lexi's sharp, confident laughter echoed from the grand entryway, followed by the lower tones of William and their wedding planner. They swept into the ballroom on a wave of celebratory energy, their arms full of fabric swatches and seating charts. They were there for their final, triumphant walkthrough. Lexi stopped dead first. Her perfectly painted smile froze, then slowly dissolved. William was a half step behind her, and when his eyes followed hers, I saw every drop of blood drain from his face. They stared at the scene before them, me in my work apron, holding a delicate brush, standing beside the owner of the castle as an equal bathed in the morning light. Gabriel, oblivious to the undercurrents, turned with a broad, welcoming smile. He told them their timing was perfect. He'd like he said for them to properly meet the head of his Billionaire restoration project and his honored guest for the season, Eleanor Vance. The words were a cannon blast in the quiet room. He didn't just reintroduce me, he redefined me. I wasn't a problem to be managed or a liability to be hidden. I was an honored guest. I was the head of the project. The carefully constructed walls of my son's new life crumbled into dust. Lexi was stunned into a rare, statuesque silence, but William just broke. I saw the terror that had been simmering beneath the surface for months finally boil over. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed Lexi's arm in a grip that was anything but gentle and practically dragged her into an adjacent antechamber, pulling the heavy oak door almost shut behind them. I didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening in that small private room. I had seen that kind of desperate, cornered animal fear in my son's eyes before long ago when he was a child who had done something terribly wrong. I could picture him, his polished facade shattering into a million pieces, the raw shame and terror finally spilling out. I could hear his choked confession, the desperate admission of his failing business, the humiliating deal he'd made with her father. He would be laying his hidden history bare not as a confession seeking forgiveness, but as a pathetic plea for understanding from a woman incapable of giving it. He was showing her the real man behind the mask, not a rising star, but a fraud terrified of being exposed. And I could picture Lexi's reaction just as clearly. There would be no empathy, no comfort. Her shock would curdle instantly into cold reptilian fury. She wouldn't see a man in pain. She would see a bad investment, a liability. I could almost hear her hissing the words, her voice dripping with the contempt she reserved for anything she deemed beneath her. She'd call him a charity case. She'd spit the fact that her father bought him. Her horror wouldn't be for his suffering, but for the fact that he had brought this mess, this woman, me, into her perfect, flawless wedding. Their alliance built on the shifting sands of ambition and lies would have just evaporated. The problem in her eyes was no longer me. It was him. When they finally emerged from the room, it was as if two entirely different people had walked out. Lexi's face was flushed with a rage. She was barely containing her eyes like chips of ice. William was ashen, a ghost in an expensive suit, looking utterly broken. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at anyone. I didn't gloat. I didn't say a word. There was a quiet dignity in silence, a power they had never understood. I simply turned back to my easel, dipped my brush in solvent, and went back to work on the portrait. My calm, my complete refusal to engage in their drama was the one thing they couldn't fight. It drove Lexi mad. Needing to reclaim some semblance of control, she strode toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble floor, ready to assert her authority as the bride, the client. She never made it. Gabriel stepped forward, placing himself subtly but definitively between us. His voice was calm, but it was laced with a steel I remembered well. He informed her that Eleanor was his guest. Her comfort and her work, he said, were his top priorities. He trusted it would not be an issue for their event. It wasn't a question, it was a command. The message was delivered clear and cold as the Atlantic outside. The wedding, the venue, their entire social standing, it was all now entirely dependent on the goodwill of the woman they had called the help. They were utterly, completely powerless. The call came the next day. It wasn't William or Lexi, of course. It was Lexi's mother. Her voice a brittle, commanding thing that was used to getting its way. She informed me not asked that she and her husband would be at the castle in an hour to clear up this unfortunate misunderstanding. It was the summons of a queen to a disobedient subject. They thought this was a negotiation, a problem that their money and influence could solve. They had no idea they were walking into a judgment. Gabriel and I didn't wait for them in a stuffy office or a formal meeting room. We waited in the main gallery, a long, beautiful hall filled with Dutch masters, the afternoon sun streaming through the tall, arched windows. We were surrounded by centuries of art and history, a silent testament to things that last. We were in our element, on our ground. They arrived precisely on time, not like a family, but like a hostile corporate delegation arriving for a takeover. Lexi's father, A thick, imposing man with the predatory stillness of a shark led the way. Her mother, draped in jewels that seemed to weigh her down, flanked one side. On the other was Lexi, her face a mask of furious indignation, and trailing behind them all was William, so pale and hollowed out he looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. They marched into the sunlit gallery, their expensive shoes echoing on the marble, bringing a chill into the warm space. Lexi's father, a man clearly accustomed to controlling every room he entered, didn't waste time on pleasantries. He launched into a condescending speech about the passions of young people and the inevitable disagreements that arise during the stress of wedding planning. He spoke as if this were a minor contractual dispute, a simple wrinkle to be smoothed over by his authority. He was trying to shrink the situation to frame my humiliation as a silly, emotional overreaction. I let him finish. I let the silence hang in the air after his final, dismissive words. There was a profound power in that silence. All their eyes were on me. I didn't look at my son. I didn't look at Lexi. I looked directly at her father. I kept my voice calm and even, letting the simple, unvarnished truth do the work. I told him there was no misunderstanding. His daughter and my son, I explained, had made it perfectly clear that I was not welcome at their wedding because my presence did not align with their family's brand. The corporate term sounded obscene in that beautiful room. Then I turned my gaze to my son, who flinched as if I'd struck him. I asked him, my voice still quiet, if it was not correct that he had told me I was too poor to be seen with him. William just stared, his mouth opening and closing silently, a fish drowning in the open air. His silence was the only confession I needed. The judgment, when it came, was not from me. It came from the sudden, horrified gasp of Lexi's mother. The blood drained from her face, replaced by a pale, waxy sheen of pure social terror. I watched the calculation happen in her eyes and her husband's. They were new money climbers, desperate for the validation of the world they were trying to buy their way into. And Gabriel Billionaire, a man of quiet, unassailable old money, was the gatekeeper to that world. In their minds, he was royalty, and they realized with a dawning, sickening horror that their children had committed the ultimate, unforgivable social sin. They hadn't just been cruel to an old woman. They had insulted the honored guest of their host inside his own home. The catastrophic public humiliation they had tried to avoid by excluding me was now happening to them 10 times over. The carefully constructed wedding wasn't just in jeopardy. It was becoming a social contagion. Lexi's mother turned on her daughter, her carefully composed face cracking with fury. I could barely hear her whisper the 3 words that sealed her daughter's fate. "What have you done?" With their united front shattered and their accusations turning inward, I delivered the final, quiet consequence. My voice was filled not with anger, but with a profound and unshakable integrity. I told them that I could not in good conscience celebrate a union that began with such cruelty and profound dishonesty, and therefore I would not be attending. Gabriel, who had been standing silently beside me, placed a warm, steadying hand on my shoulder. The gesture was a declaration of solidarity. He then addressed Lexi's family, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of finality. In that case, he announced he must withdraw the use of his home. The Billionaire name, he said, could not be associated with such values. The words, delivered so politely, were a death sentence. In that sunlit gallery surrounded by priceless art, the wedding died. Lexi's social climb ended in a free fall of disgrace. And William's career, the thing for which he had sacrificed his mother, his integrity, and his soul, was now contingent on a merger that had just become toxic. The justice I had sought was absolute, delivered not with a shout or a scream, but with the quiet, decisive closing of a very, very powerful door. They left the gallery in pieces. Lexi's father was a man who had built an empire on control, and in a single afternoon, in a room filled with silent paintings, he had lost it completely. The aftermath, from what I heard, was as swift and brutal as a guillotine. There was no slow decline, no chance for recovery. The world they worshipped was notoriously unforgiving. Within 24 hours, a sterile press release was issued, announcing that the engagement between Lexi and William was off due to differing family values. The irony was so thick it was almost comical. The day after that, Lexi's father, citing a breach of fiduciary trust, pulled every dollar of funding from William's projects. In the space of a single week, my son lost everything. He had sold his soul for the fiancé, the fast-tracked career, the gleaming apartment with the view of the harbor. The entire hollow structure of his life was demolished, and he was left standing in the rubble. Their paths after the explosion could not have been more different. Lexi, unrepentant and learning nothing, was promptly sent on an extended European holiday by her parents. It was a classic move by the wealthy, hiding their social embarrassment behind a veil of luxurious travel. From what I was told, she spent her time telling anyone who would listen that the entire fiasco was William's fault, painting herself as the victim of his deceit. She faced no real consequences, only a change of scenery. William, however, had nowhere to hide. He hit rock bottom, and he hit it hard. With no money, no career, and no allies, he was forced to finally confront the man he had become. He retreated from the world he had so desperately tried to conquer, disappearing from the glittering Newport scene. He was stripped of all his pretense, all his ambition, and for the first time since he was a boy, he was truly on his own. While their world was imploding, mine was quietly, beautifully expanding. The Billionaire castle became more than just a workplace. It became my sanctuary and my home. I wasn't just restoring a painting. I was breathing life back into a forgotten corner of the castle, and in doing so, breathing life back into myself. My days were filled with the familiar smell of turpentine and linseed oil, the quiet scratch of a brush on canvas, and the steady, comforting companionship of Gabriel. Our relationship rekindled, not with the passionate, desperate fire of our youth, but with something far more precious, the quiet, steady warmth of a shared history and a deep mutual respect. We had found each other again, not as lost lovers, but as two whole people who simply made each other better. My work on the portrait began to get noticed, and soon my name, the name my son had been ashamed of, was being mentioned with reverence in art journals. I was no longer a ghost from the past. I was Eleanor Vance, and I was home. 6 months later, the restoration was complete. The portrait of the lady, her face finally free from the grime of centuries, smiled enigmatically from her place of honor in the center of the grand ballroom. She was beautiful, vibrant, and full of stories. As I was supervising the final hanging, the afternoon mail arrived. Among the invitations to gallery openings and correspondence from museums was a simple, slightly crumpled postcard. The picture was of a rugged, wind-swept coastline, somewhere far away. I turned it over. The handwriting was messy, unfamiliar at first, but it was his. It was William's. The message wasn't an apology, not a plea for forgiveness, or a demand for a second chance. It was just a few simple sentences. He wrote that he'd seen a picture of the finished portrait online. He said she was beautiful. He told me I did amazing work. And then the final line, the one that showed the first glimmer of a man I could one day recognize again. He hoped, he wrote, to be worthy of seeing it in person one day. I looked from the postcard up to the smiling lady on the wall, and a quiet, peaceful smile touched my own lips. The restoration was complete. In the end, Eleanor's story reminds us that the most profound justice often comes not from a grand act of revenge, but from a quiet act of self-restoration. While her son and his fiancé chased the fleeting approval of others, Eleanor simply reclaimed her own worth, which had been there all along. Her victory teaches that true power is not the ability to control others, but the quiet refusal to be devalued. The most elegant justice, it seems, is simply remembering who you are and letting the world catch up.